So 7 years I've been thinking about some sort of memes and themes and issues which I feel are kind of important in terms of what is sort of shaping our world. And I want to share some of those with you briefly today. I think that we are at the edge, we stand at the edge of the adaptive range of our industrial society. And we are actually part of an economy and system that is actually faltering. And this is partly because of a whole bunch of reasons that I'm going to share with you, and partly because of a new economy that is kind of driving its way into the world in a new society. And they are actually kind of causing fault lines that are cleaving the fabric of our society along fault lines, as I said. And these are culturally between sort of organisations that want to stay attached to the old way of doing things and those that want to embrace the new. They are actually about sort of mature industries that also don't really want the change or the disruption that is happening to them. It is also about those which are in fact trained in the capabilities of new technologies and those whose skills become increasingly obsolete. And actually, structurally, in the legal systems, where those that are thriving by embracing a new way of doing things and those that are using an old regulatory system to try and stop the new in coming into our world. These are manifestations of what I call living in a non-linear world. But it goes further than that, because I think we're in a process of comprehensively restructuring society. And we have, to a degree, entered into an age of ambiguity. What comes next? We are, in fact, I think, faced with a trilemma of social, organisational and economic problems which are wicked in their very nature because they're deeply interrelated and they're highly complicated. And so I want to share with you what I mean by some of those wicked problems and actually why I think there is a new way of doing things which is actually fills me with great hope and optimism. We all know that when Lehman's went bankrupt, it was the hair trigger that precipitated the collapse of the global banking system. Yes, we know that it was a highly overcomplicated system that was very toxic. It was a house of cards waiting to fall, but what you may not know was that when Lehman's was in deep crises, Dick Fools, the CEO, was approached 6 times by companies offering to bail that company out. And 6 times Dick Fools said no, because what was on the table was not enough money. This is a trilemma when our world is framed by forgetting the morality of enough. And today we have many countries which are in deep economic crises, and yet Wall Street and hedge funds are now using that to put great pressure on sovereign debt. Rupert Murdoch was known as the 13th man in Tony Blair's government, an abuse of power, I think, which is significant. His son, James, was called by the recent ex-CEO of Billboard magazine as the saviour of modern journalism. But let me ask you this. When you do hack into the voicemails of murdered teenage girls or those victims of the 7th of July bombings, can you not agree with me that that abuse of media power means that we are on the adaptive edge of our industrialised world? The NHS has spent £12.7 billion trying to centralise all patient data records. And in fact, it was announced in The Guardian today that has finally ended. But the problem is that how they approached the problem. It was centralised, it was top down. All of that money going into private organisations and companies that didn't really understand the nature and complexity of the problem. And so there is an organisational failure that we're looking at. And we live in a more unfair world. A world, as social commentator Polly Toynbee calls, a postcode lottery in Britain, where depending on where you were born, will actually mean that you could be given a life sentence to poverty without parole. In the US, Rick Perry, who's the wannabe president, who's a senator of the state of Texas, proclaims the miracle of the Texan economy there. But the reality is that 1 in 6 children in that state has no access to health care because they have no access to health insurance. And in fact, the large majority of people which are actually working in that state to drive that economic miracle are working below the minimum age. So these kids with their mums and dads, get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go to a basketball hall court, which is what this picture is showing, to get basic medical health care, because it is the only way that they can get access to that. And what worries me is that in Britain we seem to think that market forces should be the way that we are in fact driving our NHS in the future. Our trilemma is also associated with human identity. We have geared a world above and beyond all else towards the validation of the self, the celebration of self. I rules exclusively over we. The problem is that what we've realised is that there's not a lot to validate. For many people now, they are faced with extraordinary problems in terms of identity construction, which means that a great many phobias and depressions that people have, and 1 in 4 people actually suffer from some form of kind of mental condition in their lives, is because they're fearful about the world that they live in and whether one is acceptable or not. And talking to many clinicians in the UK, they tell me that what they see is a growing ghost army that live out a precarious and vicarious existence, rattling around in the machine called life. And of course, when we become fearful, that leads to fundamental views of the world that manifest itself as individual acts, as collective acts, even as organisational acts, because we find it very difficult to live in a world that feels more ambiguous. So if we start to pull those things together, what we start to see is that for humanity we're overwhelmed in many ways that forms huge issues around identity construction and meaning. We're faced with huge organisational problems which are deeply complex in nature, which we're failing to deal with. And in fact, because we worship at the altar of the marketplace where money and I rules over everything else, we've released a form of kind of fundamentalism, a conservative fundamentalism, which is hostile to anything that has a kind of social construct to it. But this is also a story about power. Because as the Catholic Church found out, when people have access to information, when they can share and redistribute that information, when they can deliberate together as a group about what that information means, they start to become very powerful. They start to talk about who has power and how it's going to be used, how we want to lead our lives, etc., etc. Because, in fact, it was Martin Luther that used this tiny little printing press to change the course of political and social history forever. My point being that technology only succeeds when it meets fundamental human needs. And of course, the reality is that when there is a different way of doing things, a different way of looking at the world, people in positions of power don't like that because we are changing the direction of the shift of that power. So the question I asked myself, and I ask you, is are we in a technological revolution then? Or are we in a social one? Because the seemingly inexplicable explosion of everything social that is touching and impacting upon our lives in so many ways is drawn, in fact, from the deepest wells of a central issue of our time, and that is to do with human identity. As beautifully explained by Muhammad Ali, who in his shortest poem said, "Me, we." It's how we create meaningful identities. It's how we create vibrant cultures. It's how we create sustainable societies. The level of disruption I'm talking at is really at the level of our species. As we're watching and seeing a systemic failure that is happening around us, we are now using communication technologies to connect up to and across each other to create what I call a kind of human operating system that is actually going to and is already starting to challenge fundamental sources of power and control. Because actually we want to be able to lead our lives in a way that we feel is acceptable to all of us in a whole variety of different ways. And that is why participatory cultures and culture is no longer seen as quaintly authentic, but in fact is starting to play a defining role in what next looks like. Where in fact communication technologies become the connective tissue for society. I think that we are driving a very powerful meme that seeks to unleash, and is in fact unleashing, a new vision of the world, which I think we can all believe in through the tools, the technologies, the processes, the human systems that we all have, tantalisingly, at the end of our fingertips. And we already see this happening, where people are bringing in different ways of doing things into the world, and they don't ask anyone's permission. No one ever comes up and knocks on your front door and says, can I come and disrupt you? Can I take your power? So there's a friend of mine called Mohammed who runs an organisation called Patients Knows Best in the UK, which is a platform that enables people who have chronic long-term healthcare problems to come together in a participatory fashion to better learn how to manage their healthcare with clinicians. And it happens at a fraction of the cost of the waste that we see currently, because people don't understand a new way of doing things. Another friend of mine that I know, Jay Rogers, who runs a company called Local Motors, can build cars 5 times faster for 100 times less the capital cost, because they are really exploring truly alternative ways where they can craft a new type of organisational and economic capability. Another company called Grow VC, Grow Venture Community, the world's first venture fund, funded by a global community, finding very different ways in which it can connect people up to and across each other, in this instance about funding and driving entrepreneurial innovation and growth. So I look at all of you people in this room and I say, like the examples I've just shared, you are the craftsmen and craftswomen of the 21st century, that I would ask you to go out and do some disrupting to make the world a better place. Thank you very much.